So just to elaborate a bit further on things like the risk context of the project will be, as I said, prescribed by the scope of the document. But other things that you can also take into consideration to factor into the scope are things like organisational policies and procedures, legislation around the area that you're working in, industry and regulatory standards. So if we can think about things, for example, around legislation and standards, things like safety is a great example of that, because you'll have safety you'll have legislation you need to comply with the Work Health and Safety Act. You'll have regulations that you need to comply with, and standards, industry standards, and you also have policies and procedures, internal policies and procedures that will have an impact on that. But you may also think about the nature of the project within that risk context. Now, again, this will be articulated through the scope, but some projects, for example, because of the nature of the project or the work that's being done, will have an impact on the level of risk tolerance that you may have, for example, or the level of appetite that the organisation has. So if it's a high-profile project, for example, and there's a high degree of public interest in the project, that's going to change the nature of the risk and the way that we deal with that risk. But there's also things such as reputational risks. So, for example, some government departments tend to be a lot more risk averse than others because of the nature of the work that they do, because of the spotlight that they have in the public eye. And some of those terms that I've been talking about, things such as risk appetite, risk capacity, and risk tolerance, these really do factor into the way that we approach the risk and the way that we deal with our risk. So when I talk about risk appetite, I'm really talking about the amount an organisation is willing to place at risk in the pursuit of its objectives. So traditionally speaking, government organisations will have a lower risk appetite than, say, for example, a smaller business or even a tech business, for example. So we talk a lot about, in the management space, we talk a lot about what's happening in the tech space, and things such as a hacker's mentality, for example, where organisations will, in the tech space, will release software when it's not fully complete, knowing that they can deal with any kickback from the consumer regarding any minor bugs, and they can just do updates or patches to fix it up. So that comes with a risk appetite. They sort of say, okay, well, we're willing to take some risk on board. We're willing to upset the end user a little bit, as long as it's not too much and it's within their levels, what we determine to be their levels of expectation. We're happy to absorb a little bit of that risk and potential bad PR that might come out of it. And then that flows into things like a risk capacity. That's the amount an organisation is capable of losing before it endangers its own sustainability. So that's really talking about things such as the goodwill that a company has with its end users or key stakeholders. So if I continue on with that tech example, so generally with tech companies, they rely a fair bit on the goodwill of those end users to say, well, it's generally accepted that new leading technology, because of the nature and the pace that it comes out, that there is going to be maybe minor bugs with its first couple of releases, but the organisation, we're confident that the organisation will patch them up pretty quickly. So you have this level of goodwill that then the company can leverage that as part of their risk capacity. So they say, okay, we've got an appetite. We're willing to sort of, we're willing to play around with that risk a bit, and we feel that we've got quite a bit of capacity with our end users or key stakeholders. So then that leads into things like a risk tolerance, and that's the level of risk an organisation can accept. So then we're willing to take that. So so you think about that in terms of a small startup in an industry sector where there is quite a bit of appetite, capacity, and tolerance for risk, and you contrast that to, say, a major government department or agency where the playing field is very different. So the level of goodwill that we may have from your end users may not necessarily be the same, and their expectations may not necessarily be the same. So when they receive any service or any change, or even things like if there's an app update, they're not necessarily as willing for it to not be perfect. So that then flows on through the culture of the organization, when they go, okay, well, we're not so tolerant to that risk, so therefore, our appetite isn't that great to it. So we'd rather be more risk averse about that, because we don't need the publicity, we don't need the negative press around this.